It was supposed to be just another quiet evening, but what happened next left everyone speechless. In a small city where racial tensions had long been a problem, a routine stop turned into something shocking. A police officer, known for his arrogance and abuse of power, pulled over a man he assumed was just another black driver. Without hesitation, he spewed hateful words, his actions fueled by prejudice. But what he did next crossed the line. He spit right in the man's face, believing there would be no consequences. What the officer didn't know was that the man he had just disrespected wasn't an ordinary civilian. He was a highly trained FBI agent, someone who had spent years fighting against injustice. But instead of reacting with anger, the agent remained calm, knowing that karma had its own way of working things out. The officer had no idea that his career, his reputation, and his entire life were about to take a turn he never saw coming. As the situation escalated, bystanders started recording, capturing every second of the shocking encounter. The officer, still blinded by his own ignorance, continued his tirade, until the moment the agent finally revealed who he really was. That was when everything changed. The look on the officer's face, priceless. The fallout, unbelievable. Stay tuned as we uncover the jaw-dropping aftermath of this moment, proving once again that justice always finds a way. The street was silent for a moment, except for the distant hum of traffic and the blinking red and blue lights reflecting off nearby windows. The officer, still unaware of the gravity of his mistake, smirked with satisfaction. To him, this was just another night of exerting his power, another incident that would be brushed aside like all the others. But the man standing before him wasn't intimidated. He wasn't pleading or arguing. Instead, he was calm, too calm. And that's when the officer started to sense that something was off. The FBI agent, wiping his face with the sleeve of his suit, kept his hands steady. He had faced criminals, corrupt officials, and dangerous situations before, but this was different. He wasn't just witnessing an abuse of power, he was experiencing it firsthand, and he knew exactly how to handle it. But instead of lashing out, he chose to let the officer dig his own grave. The crowd around them had grown. Bystanders whispered among themselves, some holding up their phones, recording every second. Some had seen this officer behave like this before, stopping drivers for no reason, treating people with disrespect, pushing his authority beyond what was right. But this time, something was different. There was an energy in the air, a sense that justice was brewing right in front of them. Still, the officer had no clue who he had just messed with, but he was about to find out, and when he did, his world would come crashing down. The officer's smug expression remained, but there was a flicker of something else, impatience. He was used to people getting scared, pleading, or at least reacting with anger. But this man, he wasn't doing any of that. Instead, he stood there, composed, his eyes locked onto the officer's with an unsettling confidence. The officer scoffed, taking a step closer. "You got a problem," he sneered, gripping his belt as if to remind everyone of the badge he wore. He was expecting fear. But he got silence instead. The FBI agent took a slow breath, his mind working through every possible move. He had seen officers like this before, drunk on power, unchecked for too long, treating people however they pleased. Normally, he'd be the one investigating cases like this, but tonight he was in the middle of one. A voice cut through the tension. "Hey man, you know we're all recording, right?" A young man in the crowd held his phone up higher. Others followed, murmurs growing louder. The officer's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being questioned. "I don't care who's recording," he barked, but there was a shift in his tone now, the first crack in his confidence. His eyes darted to the badge on the agent's belt, barely visible beneath his jacket. Something about it made him pause. It wasn't like any ordinary ID. The agent saw the recognition creeping in, but he didn't say a word. He just let it sink in, and that's when the real panic began. The officer's breathing grew heavier as he squinted at the badge, his confidence wavering for the first time. His mind raced. Something about this man wasn't right. He wasn't scared, wasn't defensive. And that badge, it wasn't local law enforcement. It wasn't even state. His grit on his belt tightened, but his hands were suddenly sweaty. The crowd sensed the shift. Whispers turned into murmurs, and the bystanders edged closer, their phones capturing every moment. They weren't just watching a routine traffic stop anymore. This was something different, something bigger. The FBI agent tilted his head slightly, studying the officer's reaction. He had dealt with criminals who realized too late that they had crossed the wrong line, and he recognized that look now, the slow realization that the tables had turned. But he wasn't going to rush this. He wanted the officer to feel the weight of what he had done. The officer cleared his throat, straightening his stance, trying to regain control. "I don't care who you are," he snapped, but his voice betrayed him. A slight crack, a hesitation. The agent finally spoke. "You sure about that?" His voice was calm, steady, but it carried weight, the kind that made people listen. The officer's eyes flicked back to the badge, then to the crowd, then to the cameras. It was closing in on him, the reality of his mistake wrapping around him like a vice. And just when he thought things couldn't get any worse, the agent reached into his pocket and pulled out something that made the officer's face drain of all color. The officer's eyes locked onto the object in the agent's hand, a sleek, black wallet. It flipped open with a practiced motion, revealing something undeniable, a federal badge, unmistakable in its authority. The silence that followed was deafening. The crowd leaned in, cameras capturing every detail, every second of the officer's reaction. His face twitched as he struggled to process what he was looking at. His entire demeanor shifted, the arrogance draining from him like air from a punctured tire. He had just assaulted a federal agent, not just any agent, one with the power to dismantle everything he had built. His career, his reputation, his entire future. The agent didn't rush his words. "I suggest you think very carefully about what happens next," he said, his voice calm but firm. He wasn't just talking about the officer's job, he was talking about the law. The consequences, the kind that couldn't be ignored, no matter how many times this officer had gotten away with things before. But then, just as the officer opened his mouth to stammer out some excuse, a new voice cut through the air. A deep, authoritative voice. "Step away from the agent. Now." The crowd turned as another figure emerged from the shadows, another officer, but this one was different, a superior. And judging by his expression, he already knew exactly what had happened. The first officer swallowed hard. He had lost control of the situation. But what he didn't know was that this was only the beginning of his downfall. The officer's breath hitched as he turned toward the new voice. His superior stood firm, his expression unreadable, but there was no mistaking the disappointment in his eyes. The weight of the moment crashed down on him. He wasn't just in trouble, he was done. The agent calmly slipped his badge back into his pocket, his expression unchanged. He had seen this play out before, officers who thought they were untouchable, who mistook their badge for a shield against consequences. But the difference tonight? This time, there was proof, and too many witnesses to ignore. The superior officer stepped closer, his tone sharp. "You spit on a federal agent," he said, emphasizing each word. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" The first officer's mouth opened, but no words came out. His face, once filled with confidence, was now pale. He knew there was no talking his way out of this. The crowd was still recording, and in their eyes the verdict was already clear. But just when it seemed like things couldn't get any worse, the agent spoke again, this time with a twist no one saw coming. "I know exactly who you are," he said, staring straight into the officer's eyes. "I've been investigating you for months." The officer stiffened. The crowd murmured in shock. This wasn't just a random encounter. The agent hadn't just stumbled into this situation. He had been watching, waiting, gathering evidence. And tonight, the officer had just sealed his own fate. The officer's body went rigid, his eyes darting around as if searching for a way out. But there was none. The crowd had grown silent, absorbing what had just been revealed. This wasn't just a bad traffic stop gone wrong. This was the moment his entire past had caught up to him. The superior officer exhaled sharply, then turned to the agent. "We'll handle it from here," he said, his voice low but firm. There was no room for argument. He motioned for another officer to step forward, and in that moment, the reality of the situation finally sank in. The disgraced officer, who had once stood with so much arrogance, was now frozen in place. His hands twitched, but he didn't resist as his own department took control. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The FBI agent took one last look at him, then at a crowd still holding up their phones. Justice wasn't just being served tonight. It was being witnessed by the world. He adjusted his jacket and turned to leave, but not before saying one final thing. "Karma works fast," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. As he walked away, the tension in the air slowly began to fade. People exchanged glances, knowing they had just witnessed something rare: accountability in real time. And as the night carried on, one thing was clear: some people learn their lessons the hard way. And for this officer, that lesson had just begun.